space race enthusiasts. You're here to learn more about the final frontier. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Thomas Betschart, who is also part of our International Student Committee. He is studying business economics here in St. Gallen, and he's in charge of communications.
Yeah, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all from the International Students Committee. I'm in the communications department. What does that mean exactly? I'm coordinating the in-house magazine of the St. Gallen Symposium together with 8 student journalists. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this session entitled Space for Collaboration. While the space race was a key arena for competition between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, space exploration has since offered outstanding examples for international collaboration. Most notably, the International Space Station, launched in 1998.
Meanwhile, the United States has, of course, reinvested in its Space Force and NASA's Artemis project to move us back into certain parts of space. And just last year, as all of you know, the EU revealed its integrated approach to the Union's space program.
However, the future of the ISS is highly uncertain, and the issues of space junk polluting the Earth's orbit poses severe challenges to the future space exploration. So my question to the following panel would be, will the future of space exploration be marked by competition or by collaboration? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Professor for Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning at the University of St. Gallen, Mr. Damien Borth.
So, hello everybody to this very exciting session that we have today, Space Exploration, Driver for Collaboration or Competition. We have a very exciting setup here with different people from different places. We have, together with me, online, Mr. Josef Aschbacher, General Secretary, General Director of the European Space Agency, with a history in Earth observation and the Copernicus program, very important for knowing what's happening on the surface of the planet. We have together here Franklin Chang Diaz, former NASA astronaut, 7 times space shuttle missions, probably spent more time in space than our students last year on campus. And founder and CEO of a very exciting space company, Ad Astra Rocket Company. Hopefully we will hear more about that. And we have Alissa Gessler, research intern, Aerospace Security Project Center for Strategic International Studies. We just heard you finished your thesis and you are moving into the job market in this very much area that is also very exciting when we look ahead for the next couple of decades. Nevertheless, as we already heard, space exploration is an area that is having quite some history. And if you think about it, we all started with the space race between Russia and the US, in particular moving to the orbit and then beyond to the moon. Very exciting times, the 60s, a decade of innovation that we saw in that time. We know the history, the US landed on the moon, and we developed the space program further, way before my time. When I was young, what I remember, it was very exciting growing up in a time where we had the International Space Station. So it was really exciting. That opened up an era of collaboration between the major players in the space place. That was Russia and the US, and many, many other collaborators, including the European Space Agency, including other agencies around the world. So I remember when the first 2 modules were connected, that was a Russian module and US module. The US module was called Unity, very symbolic. That was the time after the Cold War, very exciting. I had a lot of hopes, all those promises, we will go to space and move beyond to the Mars and live on the moon. That was all the time really exciting. We moved, discovered a lot about ourselves with this Earth observation programs and the experiments and the knowledge that we gained at the International Space Station. And then we moved recently in a time where, first of all, private companies were moving into space. So that brought a little bit of agility into the entire industry, which is very much appreciated. And then later also, just recently, the kind of tensions that we see between the Russian and the US with regard to the International Space Station. We see that there is some kind of discussions about the future of the ISS, the directions in which the entire area might go. But these are not the only players. We have the European Space Agency being a very important contributor. I just was at the beginning of the week at the Swiss Remote Sensing Days, speaking about very interesting research that is done with regard to climate change, sustainability, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have another player that might be not that visible, China, that is able to bring people and cargo into low Earth orbit with regard to a frequency that is really amazing, almost weekly. We also see it with SpaceX and the Falcon rockets. So my question is, it's a little bit crowded, right, up there. And the question would be, what's your opinion about the next decades that we will have in space exploration with regard to collaboration or competition? And I would like to start here with Mr. Aschbacher being online to start with that, and would hand over then to every member of this panel. So Mr. Aschbacher, how do you see like the next decade? Collaboration or competition, or both? I guess we need some audio.
So somebody, is it working now?
It's working. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Awesome.
Sorry but I do hear an echo on my side.
Mm-hmm. As I always mention, the most competitive and important part of technology is connecting the projector of your presentation, including remote. It's
you can launch rockets and satellites, but sometimes the Wi-Fi connection and the internet setup is the big challenge. You're absolutely right, yeah?
Very much true.
So I think it works now. So no, first of all, thank you for having me on this. I would very much like to be with you. I see that you are very cozily sitting here on these chairs, and I'm participating from my Brussels office. We have several offices across Europe, but of course Brussels is a very important partner for many corporations, and just having meetings here. So the future of space, next decade, competition or cooperation. In fact, just last week I was in the US at Kennedy Space Center launching an astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti. You may have followed this in the news. And you see there firsthand what's going on and how fast this is all going. And I'm very happy to see a former astronaut with us in this round. It's really fascinating, first of all, what NASA is doing and has been doing in order to establish private companies like SpaceX. You mentioned them, but also several others, Blue Origin, Sierra Space, just to mention a few, but there are tons of others who are really going into a commercialization of space now. And this is something that is great. And for me as Director General of ESA, this is really wonderful to see. Of course, my question I'm asking myself and my member states is, what do we do in Europe? And how can we also in Europe build up a very strong commercial landscape in space? Just to put it in context, we are a very important partner on the space station together with NASA, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, Canada, and of course Russia. So we have constant, or not constant, but frequent presence of astronauts in space. Until a few hours ago, we had actually 2 astronauts at the same time in space. Matthias Maurer has just undocked and is on his way down and will return back to European soil tomorrow night. And I will welcome him at our ESA Astronaut Center in Cologne. But we are having really a cooperation there, which has been built up over more than 2 decades on the space station, but also on other space projects. We have very strong cooperation with many partners, and the US obviously being our very strong partner in many aspects. On the other side, as you say, there's also competition, and competition means that we have to build up a strong capacity. Europe actually has a very good industrial landscape, a very competitive one. If, for example, satellites are offered on the commercial market, European industry is quite often winning some of this competition. We are by far the largest area where export contracts are being won by European industry. Also, the reason being that the space budgets from the public side, from the European Space Agency, for example, are smaller compared to NASA. We have about a third of the budget of NASA. If you include also the civilian, the defense part, then it's about a sixth or so. So the public money certainly is much smaller, but the capacity is really great. So we are building up, and one of my agendas as the DG of ESA since about a year now, is to build up and strengthen the European excellence, but also funding of space in Europe through public means, in order to help the private sector also to develop companies like we see them also overseas. So yes, it's both. It is competition on one side, but if you are not a strong partner, then if you don't have a very competitive program, you cannot be a respected partner, and that's exactly, I think, at the core of it. So you need competition in order to forge strong partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So there's some ground in the middle, and very understandable, asking for a raise of the budget. Very much would also suggest that. But the partnership with the other countries and the competition, we have here, Franklin, with you, somebody who partnered in the past with different nations being in space, really depending on those partners, and also being a member or being part of the private sector. How do you see this question with regard to the next decade or decades in space exploration?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me to this event. It's extraordinary to be here sharing with all of you. I totally agree with Joseph's point of this balance between collaboration and healthy competition. I mean, I've been around long enough to remember back in the 80s when it was at least at NASA and in the astronaut office, it was heresy to think that we would be ever working with the Soviet Union. Things changed. The chemistry changed, and for the good. And it was because of that relationship that we built up that this aggregation of nations began to get put together, and the space shuttle program ended, in my opinion, a little prematurely, but nonetheless, I'd say the Russians, carried the continuity of the program and enabled the continuation of the effort, the construction of the International Space Station and the working together until such time as the commercial private companies could get their chops, together to actually fly commercial astronauts. So you see that transition, and I think that what's happening now is the world has become aware that space is really a place of business. There's money to be made, and the profit motive is an extraordinarily powerful force. It drives people to do all kinds of things, and the private sector has now been put into this mix. And the chemistry is a lot more interesting with many countries getting involved. It would be totally silly to think that space is only available to, a small group of nations. That wouldn't make any sense. So space really needs to be open to everyone. And I see this chemistry developing, and I'm very happy to see it that way. Ukraine is a terrible situation. I hope it gets resolved. But I mean, humans are going to go into space regardless. So, yeah.
So collaboration again. So Alyssa, you saw now here a representative from European Space Agency with its member states, member of the private sector, and watching that. We already mentioned it, it's a little bit crowded up there. So the question would be, and you're an expert in policy and regulation, so who owns the space, or who has the right to occupy a low Earth orbit, right? So with regard to that, how would you see the next decade with regard to competition or collaboration?
Yeah, that is a fabulous question. And also thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the University of St. Gallen for welcoming me as a leader of tomorrow. So I'm really here to represent the voice of youth in this dialogue, and to that end, I am a policy officer with the Space Generation Advisory Council. We're an international nonprofit organization that works to apply the creativity and vigor of youth to advance humanity through the peaceful uses of outer space. I'm not speaking here on behalf of the organization, but in my work with them, I've seen a lot of appetite for collaboration. We are on group chats and Zoom calls. We're writing Google documents together. We're in WhatsApp chats sending space memes. And so in terms of what the next generation wants, we don't just want collaboration, we're already doing it. That being said, we have some really onerous challenges in front of us, and you just spoke to some of it, who owns space. From the legal perspective, nobody owns space. No state is entitled to lay a claim of sovereignty to outer space. But then we get into some sticky questions. If you are occupying a large piece of space by virtue of taking up many orbits for your satellites, are you effectively laying a claim of sovereignty? And I'm not here to answer that question today, but those are dialogues that are actively unfolding that we have to be attentive to. And so, yeah, looking to the next 10 years, is it going to be competition? Is it going to be collaboration? I wish I could give a really firm stance and say one or the other, because that's exciting. But unfortunately, I do think it's a mix of both. And on the competition side, we are working to grapple with orbital debris, right? And so orbital debris might be a situation that incites collaboration by virtue of the fact that the debris does not discriminate against spacecrafts on the basis of their nationality or the flag that they fly under. So it threatens all space operations equally. However, there's some states that have put the orbital debris up there more than other states. So when we talk about established spacefaring nations, the US, Russia, China, versus emerging spacefaring nations, we see different duties when it comes to preserving and protecting the outer space environment for future generations. So there will be some competition for resources and competition over defining the terms of how we explain and interpret international law. But as a young person who loves space and is deeply invested in this sector, I can say we are willing and eager to collaborate across national borders to see how far we can take humanity in terms of space exploration.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the very important topic of space debris. I guess it was a couple of years ago, a question to Mr. Aschbacher, where the European Space Agency had to start a maneuver without discussion and coordination with SpaceX at that time. There was, I guess, the first time where something like this happened, there was a miscommunication issue. The communication channels were not as quickly connecting the private sector and the agencies. So how do you see this particular topic, space debris? Because that's something that, and you have a lot of satellites with the ESA, is actually creating increasing danger for every object that is maintained in low Earth orbit or geostationary orbit.
Damon, you're very well informed, as I see. In fact, there was an incident. This was in 2017, where Aelos, it's one of our research satellites, quite an important one, also pretty expensive one, was on a collision course with a Starlink satellite. And this was the early days of Starlink at this time. And yes, you're absolutely right. It actually made headlines that there was a collision, and our operators in ESOC in Darmstadt were trying to reach somebody on space SpaceX side and say, look, your satellite is colliding with ours. What shall we do? Are you moving? Are we moving? And who is responsible? Or who is flying what we call a collision avoidance maneuver? We couldn't reach anyone, or our operators couldn't reach anyone. And there was really, these were the early days, and there was not the communication established. At the end, we decided just to move, just to avoid collision, although ours is much bigger and therefore a bit more complex to move. And of course, it turned out there was no damage, and at the end, it was all fine. But what we learned from this is really that we need to establish these channels operationally. I can tell you that today, a couple of years later, it's seamless, and we have very, very good cooperation with SpaceX, but with also other commercial operators, and there is no issue whatsoever. The opposite, actually, they pre-warn us if one of their satellites is getting off course and is risking a collision and so on. So this is working out pretty well. But you are also right, and it was mentioned before by Alisa, that more and more satellites come up into orbit. Today we have a bit more than 4,000 active satellites in orbit, and quite a number, several thousand of inactive ones. That means that are dead at the end of their life, and they are tumbling around or flying around. And of course, some of them controllable, most of them not. And this is the danger. And the number of debris, that means garbage in orbit, is really increasing significantly. This is a concern, and this needs urgent action, both at institutional level, that means government to governments, because these licenses for satellites are given by governments through the ITU, and of course nationally then endorsed. So it needs action at the government level, but also simply between the main players. As I say, as ESA, we are a public entity, of course, composed of 22 member states, but also we interact on a daily basis with the private sector just to make sure that everything is fine and we are not colliding. So yes, there's urgent action needed. In fact, we are in good discussion there with the various players, but it needs to be really put in place that we have rules, traffic rules like we have on ground or in the air, and you need the same traffic rules in space, which everyone accepts. And if you drive on the wrong side of the road, then you risk a collision. The same principles we need to establish there as well. But there's another point which is quite important, is to minimize debris in orbit. And there are different ways of doing it. First of all, that you get out your inoperative satellites, that means the inactive ones, at the end of their life. Secondly, if there is debris, that you may actually grab it literally with another satellite, like an arm that is embracing it, is grabbing it and taking it down to a lower orbit and then deorbiting it, or other ways of really removing debris actively in space. So what I am propagating is not yet agreed, but what I want to achieve is what we call a debris neutrality by 2030, very similar to the carbon neutrality by mid of the century, but like many countries have subscribed to. But I would like to reach debris neutrality by by the end of this decade. And this is something which, of course, requires the players involved. And ESA would like to be an example to work with others, obviously, to achieve that. And this is one of the big challenges which indeed we have.
Okay, so I assume you already have the mobile phone number of Elon Musk, given this incident, so just reach somebody in charge.
I do, yeah.
And also very interesting, debris neutrality. So we have net zero, right, with regard to climate change. So we will have debris zero also, which I think is very, really exciting. And I would like to come back to this kind of geonational situation, because we might all discuss how well we can agree on particular rules, how to use low Earth orbit or the orbit in general, how we can think about bringing cargo and mass up and also being neutral with regard to that. And this is probably working very well among the partners like ESA, NASA, and the others. But there is this player, which is China, with regard to this very strong program that they have, very frequent flights. And the question would be also, how is the communication going on with China with regard to the coordination on the one side? But first of all, I would like to jump to Alisa and how is the setup regulatory with Chinese partners? Because they wanted to be involved at the ISS, they were not allowed given the reasons of the sensitivity. They're building up an own space station currently. They will bring a lot of mass to low Earth orbit. So the question is like, how is the discussions going on with regard to this very new and strong entity that is moving to space?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, and one that folks like me who really advocate for space collaboration worry about. So in 2011, Congress passed something called the Wolf Amendment, which forbade NASA from collaborating with China on any space-related effort, unless there was prior approval from the FBI and from Congress. So we've seen that happen a couple of times where there's been limited collaboration between NASA and its Chinese counterparts, but very, very limited. And so there are some national security reasons for that have been stated, and it was realized once again in the most recent federal appropriations bill. So it looks like that trend will hold of there not being collaboration between the US and China in space. And as you alluded to, China has their own space station. And China is also obviously not a partner on the Artemis Accords, which is the US-led project to get to the moon by 2025. So we see the US and its allies over here in this camp, and China and Russia over here in this camp, innovating separately to get back to the moon, which does seem like a bit of a waste of talent. And it's very difficult to overcome the very geopolitical reasons that isn't happening, which is really just emblematic of the fact that just because you go to space doesn't mean you leave your terrestrial baggage behind, right? So our politics do extend into outer space. Circling back to the topic of orbital debris, though, China is launching a lot of objects, but in terms of how much debris they own, they're trailing significantly behind the US and Russia. So data that I think it was from 2020 from the company RS Components put the amount of orbital debris owned by Russia at about 14.5 thousand. The US was just shy of 9,000 objects of space debris, and China was just shy of 5,000 objects of space debris. So I just think it's important to always contextualize when we're talking about, fixing global problems, making sure that we recognize, okay, well, who owns the problem the most, and therefore who needs to take the lead on remediating that problem more actively. All states can work on space debris mitigation, practicing making sure they're deorbiting their satellites at the end of their lifetime. But some states have a little bit more responsibility in terms of cleaning up space.
Mm-hmm. And the Franklin question, you were in space, so this is a very tangible problem, threatening life. And you were also working with different nations. So being in space, like in collaboration, and we're just among ourselves right here. So how was the collaboration? Were there topics that, I can imagine if you're staying in space with people from other nations, independently of the policy on Earth, you're becoming friends, you're depending on them. Were there really like kind of a setup where you said like this kind of information, or there is a little bit of a distance to particular partners? And how have you dealt with that when you were there and really depending on that?
Yeah, you pretty much cease to be a citizen of a country and become a citizen of a planet. And people don't really talk very much about their nationalities, with the exception of just pointing out, cultural nice things to point out how we are different, but how we really are the same. Going to the orbital debris just for a little bit,
sure.
I tell you, it's very hard to control this debris once it gets out of hand. All you need is a tiny little screw, a little speck of paint from a satellite, which is moving at 17,000 miles an hour, or 7 kilometers a second. And if it's coming against you, it's twice that. So if you happen to be an astronaut doing a spacewalk and you get hit by one of these things, you're pretty much dead. And it's a very sobering thought that it is all due to us not managing our trash. We have to be able to, as humans, recognize that we do have an impact in the environment, and the environment is not just the environment here on the surface, but we're extending the environment to low Earth orbit and beyond. So somebody needs to go and clean up this mess. and and there will be somebody who's going to have to pay. It's not going to, trash collection is not free. Somebody has to pay, and somebody can make money from that. So,
Exactly.
I just think humans, we as a human race have now come face to face with our own waste. We have come to realize that the environment is not the bottomless pit that we have always thought it was. For thousands of years, we just dump our trash and it disappears in the ocean or somewhere. No more. And so now we got to pay, and it's going to cost, and somebody's going to have to clean it up.
Yeah. So we have this debt up there. We need debris zero, debris neutrality. We already recognized Joseph has the mobile phone number of Elon Musk. I would like to ask the question because you're also in the private industry. So I actually wanted to ask the question, what's the difference between you and Elon Musk? You both own and are the founders and CEOs of a rocket company. But there's a big difference. You were in space, he's not, right?
Yeah. Well,
but
there is a supply chain. We talked about supply chain and logistics. We went to the moon in the late 60s. It was unsustainable. It was just a stunt, to beat the Soviet Union in a race. And the US won the race, and it's very clear, wonderful. But the situation is different now. We need to go back to the moon in a sustainable way. To do that, we need to build the infrastructure, the capability to supply, to bring the logistics, and this business of moving logistics in a sustainable, economical way. That is the business that we're in. I think SpaceX is also in that business, but they're in the business of launching. Somebody has to launch the stuff up into space, but once the stuff is up in space, then somebody has to pick it up and take it, from point A to point B and do all that transportation. So that's kind of what's happening. One of my friends, Mark Sirangelo, who developed the Dream Chaser, he calls it the railroad. We're building the railroad, which in the United States enabled the expansion to the West because it created a service economy. And that's what we're doing. We're moving out, and it's really nice.
And it's, from my point of view, time to do so. So very much appreciate that. Could you just a little bit, because I found it very interesting, the engine that you're developing, Vasimir. Could you give us a little bit of a kind of description, difference to all the other engines that are out there? Because I think this is fascinating.
You'll watch Star Trek? Actually, no. What we're developing is a new type of propulsion system to enable humans to travel to Mars fast. This is the fundamental problem we now have, and that the chemical, rocket, which has become our workhorse, is not suitable for fast missions to Mars. And obviously, we're not going to stop at Mars. We're going to keep going, right? So we need a new propulsion system. And that is what we've been working on for the last 40 years. This is our kind of been a lifelong effort. It is a plasma engine. It is an electric motor. So we're moving to electrification, electric transportation on the Earth.
It's a trend.
We're also moving to electric transportation in space. And so it is a plasma engine where the exhaust is a high temperature plasma, which is as hot as the sun. So much, much better. Yeah. And so if you want to go to Mars fast, you can go with a plasma rocket in 2 to 3 months. Instead of taking the slow boat, which would be a chemical rocket, which will take you maybe 7-8 months to get there. So these are the things that are happening. And for the young people in the audience, this is what you can look forward to.
Yeah, so you are developing the speedboat for space.
Yeah.
Joseph, would this be something for you guys, for the deep space missions?
No, absolutely. We are working, and I'm really fascinated by Franklin's plasma engine propulsion system. This is exactly what we need. If we want to go towards Mars and beyond, by the way, then you need a new propulsion system as one of the challenges that has to be overcome. There are some others as well, radiation, as we all know. Obviously, then once you land on Mars, you need to live there, or you want to live there, and oxygen and, of course, food and many other things are a major obstacle as well. So there are big challenges still on our plate. We are working on them on a daily level. We have now robots that we are sending there, which are, of course, the first explorers. At least they give some information, but they can never replace an astronaut, a human, who, of course, sees things very differently, can act on the spot in a very different way. So, yes, the longer term, medium to longer term perspective certainly is going towards Mars. But let's first go back to the moon again. And here the US, with the Artemis program, is having a fascinating program. I'm very happy to say that also Europe is an essential part of the Artemis program. That you even see the ESA logo on the SLS rocket if you look carefully under the NASA logo, obviously. But certainly to say that together, NASA first and foremost, but together with Europe, we're going back to the moon. Make sure that the moon as a next economic zone is really being properly used. There's a lot of research still to be done, a lot of technologies and developments that are needed to basically understand how to really build up a home and house in another celestial object, the moon being the first one, and then obviously as a stepping stone to Mars. So yes, there's a huge, exciting portfolio of technology developments that we are pursuing. And propulsion, as was just said, is certainly one of the big challenges which we need to address.
Yeah, with faster engines, there's less travel time, less radiation. It makes things easier for particular distances. Yeah. But, assuming I strongly believe that we will be able to go to the moon, to Mars, maybe beyond, I'm not sure if I will be still there. But Alyssa, if we already have kind of challenges in agreeing how to take care of our orbit, how do we manage actually to think about how to deal with the moon, the Mars planet, or even going beyond? The more far away those destinies are, the more difficult it is to kind of talk about them, right? And I know that the moon landing sites, they are protected, right? You should not jump on the same spot to preserve it. Is there any development in kind of discussing how to deal with those, places that are far away?
Yeah, a wonderful question. So I'm so excited about the return to the moon and all of the promise that it has. As the legal person, I'm always the one with a little red flag that I'm waving. And the thing that does worry me about lunar exploration is that while we do have the Outer Space Treaty, which the majority of United Nations member states are party to, the Moon Agreement that was written and approved by the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is not a very popular treaty and doesn't have the buy-in of some of the biggest spacefaring actors, US and Russia included. So there's a huge need to continue this dialogue on what responsible use of lunar resources looks like, what it means to start building a territory on the moon, right? Again, no state can lay sovereign claim of territory to a celestial body. And so how do we balance that, not laying a claim of sovereignty, but starting to build, space for us to explore on the moon? So that's not to say that we shouldn't do it. Space exploration is extremely important, but there's a really urgent need to continue these dialogues, not with only our allies and our partners, but with the countries that we don't always get along with that are also going to be going to the moon as well.
Yeah, and we were talking about the large space nations, but as we already mentioned, the orbit and space should belong to everybody. Mm-hmm. There's this endeavor of democratizing space and allowing everybody to go to space or get their share of that. Any opinions on this direction? Franklin, maybe you?
Well, I come from a very tiny country, Costa Rica. I was born there and grew up there. And, Costa Rica, believe it or not, has a space agency. This is like maybe 3 people. I mean, this is just maybe an office, okay? They just started it. Why? Why? Because, people realize that space offers an opportunity that is independent of your land mass. You don't need to have big, huge resources of, raw materials or anything to get into space. All you need to have is, gray matter. Gray matter is all you need. That's the only resource you need. And we got, most people are pretty much smart. And we got plenty of those as well in Costa Rica and the rest of the world. So I think this democratization is the logical thing that will happen. And ultimately, in my view, humans will move out. I mean, I don't mean to say that we're gonna, leave the Earth, like a, discard it like an old shoe. Hopefully, we will preserve it and keep it beautiful and pristine. But we need to gain time to do this homework that we need to do to be able to enable humans to really move out into infinite possibilities of space. And the Earth, ultimately, in my view, will become a national park, essentially a protected area of humanity. Most humans will be elsewhere, and humans will come back to Earth to see where they came from.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, you were in space, and I heard it also from Thomas Reiter that I met a couple of years ago. It's the blue dot from Carl Sagan, right? Yeah. There are no borders, and it's the one place where we all live. Nevertheless, I would have still a question for Josef. I mean, many countries are moving to space, and the European Space Agency is an organization that encapsulates many member states. How do you think about these movements that are currently, like Luxembourg, for example, other countries, many that are having interest in that direction?
It's really fascinating what happens at the moment. I mentioned before some examples of the US, but also in Europe, it's quite fascinating. Luxembourg, since you mentioned it, I was there on earlier this week, was Monday or Tuesday, where a big conference was opened on space resources. Space resources are something people have been laughing about a couple of years ago, and now it is a very serious not only conference, but a very serious business that is building up there. In other words, when you go to the moon, as an example, or then further to Mars and beyond, there are rocks there that can be used, and that can be used for building infrastructure, building colonies, maybe also for future parts of a rocket, or maybe even propulsion systems that may be built actually on the moon or in space. And this is quite fascinating, of course, using 3D printing technologies and quite a big advancement on material sciences. But yes, all this is happening. And Luxembourg is one example, the smallest country of our ESA member states in terms of people, but the #1 country in terms of allocation of space budgets per capita. It's quite remarkable, actually, how this forward-looking country is investing into the future. And of course, we have many other things as well. I mean, we are building up missions together with NASA going to Mars. We had, in fact, a rover which was meant to go with Russia to Mars as well, called Rosalind Franklin on ExoMars. Unfortunately, we had to stall, to suspend this project, and now we are looking with other partners, most likely some of our US friends on the way forward. But yes, there is a lot of exciting exploration ongoing. Obviously, a low Earth orbit, as mentioned by Franklin, is still our #1 destination, but soon the moon will be the next one, and then the one after that will be Mars. So yes, there's plenty of activities and projects ongoing, and really, really excited. In fact, what you mentioned earlier, Damien, in your introduction, the moon, the race to the moon, and of course we all know the outcome of that. Today we have a second space race, and it's really so intense that you see races between different countries. Alisa was mentioning the China, US centered spheres into which the world seems to divide today, and in space this is also observed. But also the private sector is today playing a role as they never had before, and this is really firing up this race, and it's really exciting times for space.
Yeah, the agility of the private sector is amazing, and it's very healthy, I think. I would like to open up to the audience if there are any questions, and there are probably a couple of. And I would just start here with this lady in the front, and we have people distributing microphones. So.
Hello, thank you so much for your time. My name is Natalie. I'm a leader of tomorrow, an engineer and, of course, a huge space enthusiast. I'm from Mexico. So my question is, do you have any type of collaboration with Latin America? And what is or would be the value and advantage of this collaboration? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you have this question for a particular person or for all of us?
If it's possible, for the three of us, of you.
Okay, so collaboration with Latin America. I would start, Joseph, maybe you can answer that. If there is something, then continue with...
I can certainly answer, because the answer is a very loud yes. We have a lot of cooperations. In fact, ESA is known to be the one that cooperates with really almost everyone. Unfortunately, with one partner in the East, we have now to change this cooperation scheme. But yes, we have cooperation with Mexico. We have cooperations with Latin America. Latin America is at the moment establishing a regional space agency, a bit like modeled on ESA. We have 22 countries in Europe, and in Latin America, there's also an agency being established with a number of Latin American countries. But with Mexico, yes, it's actually quite an active and strong nation, and we have several activities from science to some cooperations in outer space. So yes, a very good partner. Maybe just one example to highlight a bit what we do. There was an issue of sargassum, you may know it, and we provided a lot of data from Earth observation satellites, from the Copernicus data to our Mexican friends to really better manage and see what happens and where it goes, and to protect basically the coastlines from the sargassum. Okay,
great to see that. Franklin, any collaboration that you have?
The answer is yes. I mean, I didn't want to extend the answer too long because there may be other, but yes, absolutely. Everybody is invited to the table. Yeah.
Alyssa?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, the organization I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, the Space Generation Advisory Council, we have so many wonderful members from Latin America. And probably my favorite moment at a recent event I went to with them was when a young woman from Ecuador started talking about how her country had applied Earth observation data to identify a certain pattern of invasive species that were really undermining local agriculture. And so just a really fabulous example of how space is becoming, like states are finding wonderful niche applications of space utilities. So.
Awesome, thanks a lot. Another question, we will have this gentleman over there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the...
Yeah, okay, but fair enough, yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question is on space mining. Recently, a lot of new interests by both public and private space companies are on space mining. So I just want to ask, is this something feasible? Like, there have been interest that space mining could be an option for us to mitigate the environmental impacts of mining on the planet. So I just want to know, is this something feasible on the long run?
Interesting. Who wants to answer?
Take it? Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
The answer is absolutely yes. The answer is yes. And of course, you need a propulsion system that can enable you to move large objects like, mineral-rich asteroids. You don't want to mine them because they're orbiting the sun. So it's very inconvenient, to mine them in that orbit. So you need to be able to move them to a more convenient place, such as maybe orbit the moon, for example, which is always at the same distance from the Earth, and you can have access. So the ability to move large objects is key. Mining is mostly going to start with water. I mean, water is going to be a consumable that's going to be precious in space, and we're not going to get it from the Earth. Most likely we'll mine it on the moon, we'll mine it on Mars, maybe on asteroids. So yeah, mining, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, then I would go to this gentleman. You can stand up. That would make it a little bit easier. So very interesting mining, yeah. The question would be, do we move the sustainability issues then just out of space? But yeah.
Thank you. My name is Miguel, also from Mexico. My question is, we understand that this space exploration is mostly a technical conversation most of the times, but it is also a political conversation. My background is in diplomacy, so I'm interested in knowing what should diplomats be discussing at the UN and other multilateral forums regarding space exploration and potential collaboration. We know, you mentioned, Alyssa, the treaties that we have are pretty outdated to some extent. And I'm wondering what are the areas of opportunity that international law has regarding space international law, and what should be diplomats be negotiating or at least discussing at this forum? And this question is for Alyssa.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, really wonderful question. Diplomacy and diplomatic departments are such an important part of space operations. And, I know obviously the impact of the US Department of State in Space Best, and they are a really huge lever for space operations and going abroad and using their diplomatic missions all over the world to foster collaboration, make those connections that we need because space is ultimately a very collaborative industry. In terms of what a diplomat should focus on in space, it's kind of a hard question for me to answer because, like you mentioned, space is political, and so states pursue things that are in line with their own interests. Thankfully, different states' interests do overlap very often, and I would say probably the biggest baseline interest that all spacefaring states share is space traffic management, which helps make sure, we've kind of alluded to that today, but those are all of the practices that keep us from bumping into each other in space and ruining one another's assets. That relates as well to orbital debris, right? And some of these conversations we had today about collision maneuvers. But that would probably be the biggest line item for diplomatic applications for space.
Cleaning up in the front yard, right? Before we move further.
Yeah.
Another question I would take somebody from the back. There is a hand raised with a blue shirt. Yeah. Maybe we can have a micro.
Hello, thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. When recently, with Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin getting to space and initiating the commercial inclusion and inclusion of the private citizens into the space industry, it was that I was hooked on the screen, and I am convinced that space exploration as a frontier is very important. But immediately after the launch was over, social media was flooded with people questioning the essence of space exploration at a time when we are faced with imminent threats on the Earth. And so it was a question about resource competition and trade-offs as to where do we invest the limited resources that we have on the planet. So as a limited part of the space community is convinced that going to space is important, but the rest of the world does not seem to share our enthusiasm about the beauty of space exploration. So do you think this is a threat? Do you think this is a challenge to the space exploration community in general? Because we know that social mindsets influence political behaviors, and then budgets to the space industry also get influenced in that particular chain. So do you think that the shared essence of realizing the beauty behind space exploration is dwindling right now because of the imminent threats that we face on Earth? And how do you think we should proceed from here? Thank you. And I would like to address this to Astronaut Diaz. Thank you.
Oh, I thought it was Joseph that...
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that's a beautiful question. If I may, I would hand over to Joseph, who was also heading the Copernicus program and the Earth observation. I mean, we can go to space to look to us back, right, to Earth observation. And there are plenty of opportunities to help us on Earth from the orbit. So, Joseph, I guess you have a lot of ideas with regard to that.
I have a lot to say to this. No, thanks a lot. And this is really a fantastic question you're asking. And I'm faced with exactly the same question many times by politicians and by the people. And it's absolutely true what you just said, that with space technology, the Copernicus program was mentioned as one good example. You monitor our planet on a daily basis. We say we are taking the pulse of our planet from space. And by taking the pulse, first of all, you need to understand, I can tell you that many of the knowledge we have today about our planet and the climate change issues related to it and all the sustainability discussion which we are leading across the world is based on information from satellites, from space data. And this is fundamental because otherwise you wouldn't understand your global system. For example, ice melting in the Arctic, sea level temperatures, sea level rise. These are all global phenomena, and space by definition is global. And therefore you really need your space assets to understand how your planet functions. And it's not only the observation. Of course, the next step then is to simulate our planet. We call it digital twin Earth, to create a digital twin of our planet on a big computer and simulate what happens if? So what happens if I change this parameter? What happens if the rainforest is deforesting faster? What happens if coal power plants are firing 10 years longer than expected? What happens if we don't convert from fuel-based traffic into electric traffic, and so on and so forth? So you can really simulate all these situations, and that, of course, gives decision makers a good basis to make decisions and therefore plan our future on Earth. So yes, space is fundamental for the preservation of our planet and for sustainability. And there are many of those examples. Of course, you always talk about exploration because it's so exciting and it's inspiring and fascinating. But actually what people don't know many times is that how much in daily life our space technology is used to preserve our planet.
Yeah, and I would like to highlight also that the Copernicus program is the program that is giving all the data available for free to the public good. So this is something where, for example, Switzerland as a member state is kind of investing for all of us. And this is really amazing, independently of where you're coming from. And just recently, Jan Wegner and Konrad Schindler released the first ever made map of the planet's surface and the tree heights that were built on a LiDAR sensor being attached to the ISS and then extrapolated with Sentinel-2 data and the deep neural network. So we know for the first time how much biomass we have over ground, which is very important to think about net zero, right? Not only the CO2 emissions that are put into our atmosphere, but also the biomass that stores that. We're unfortunately running a little bit out of time here, and to wrap up everything, I would like to ask for every panelist like 2 questions, and kindly ask to be short. The question number 1 would be, what do you hope the next 10 years bring? And the question number 2, what do you think they will bring? And let's see how much difference there is. And I will start, Alyssa, with you.
Sure. I hope it brings viable, reliable, and consistent orbital debris removal technology. Sorry to be a broken record here. What I think it will bring, perhaps in addition to that, are some legal trouble related to the dual-use technology, which is orbital debris removal.
And what you think will happen?
I think there will be a lot of legal conflicts and perhaps an increased sense of threats between states over the use of this technology.
I see. Thanks a lot. Franklin?
Well, I think I hope that we will actually finish the railroad, get it built, so that we can start the journey.
So going far beyond where we've ever been.
Absolutely.
And what do you think?
Well, as I said earlier, humanity eventually will live mostly off the planet. And the Earth hopefully will be protected.
Wonderful statement. Joseph, what's your statement with regard to those 2 questions?
What I really believe or hope that will happen is that space is really used to preserve our planet and making sure that we have a good future for still billions of people for certainly decades to come. I do agree with Franklin that eventually we venture out. I think that time frame is probably a bit far away. So until we have our planet A, I really hope that everyone is putting all its space assets together to make sure that this planet is preserved. What I think will happen, or what I fear will happen, or what I think will happen is that we are not reaching a situation where we are peacefully exploring space together, and there will be competition increasing along these 2 geopolitical lines mentioned before. I wish very much we could join forces because space is expensive, is dangerous, and it is important to work together in order to really pool these energies. And as somebody was saying, it was you, Franklin, when you're out there, you see yourself as one of the planet and not one of a certain country. And I think this really would hope that this would materialize.
So I will finish with my statement. I hope that the things that were promised to me when I was a kid, that we go to space, they will finally happen. What I'm a little bit concerned is that I might be old and gray-haired. I'm already gray-haired, but it might take longer than we believe. But I very much thank everybody on the panel for this discussion. It was really interesting to explore those different directions. Everybody who was online there in the stream, Joseph being also online, and everybody in the room asking those wonderful questions. Sorry to not be able to answer all these questions, but we had, I guess, a lot of insights here, and we're very much looking forward to the youth, because the youth is not talking about it. They're already doing collaboration, as we saw already. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause to everybody on the panel.